I'm really honored to be invited here to give this keynote lecture at the Center for the Robarts Center for Canadian Studies. So thank you to Jean-Michel and to Laura Tannen for organizing the conference. Thank you to Evangeline Kroon and all the students who also worked to organize this conference. This keynote lecture has allowed me the opportunity to gather together some of the thinking and the research I've been doing for the last 2 years. And I'm doing that in this lecture in a holistic kind of way, but I will touch on two research projects in particular. One project is called the Young People Making a Living in the Creative Industries. I'm grateful for the support from my research assistants, Anna Frey and Celeste Aliquot, who did a lot of interviewing and data analysis in that project. Lucy Woke did website and survey instrument design for data collection in that project, so I'm grateful for that support. I'm also going to touch on my community youth arts programs as creative industries incubators research project, and I'm grateful to the support from my research assistants, Calla Evans and Johannes Valdez, who really led the participant observation over a year and a half and did interviewing and data analysis. Kate Krebs and Lucy Woke supported with transcription and literature review, research, and data collection. So I'm grateful for that support. I'm grateful to SSHRC and for Ryerson University for funding me to allow me to do my work and to employ students. Thanks to Evangeline for the land acknowledgement. To me, land acknowledgements invite us to think about our historical embeddedness in unequal relations and our responsibilities towards Indigenous peoples and to one another. The York University land acknowledgement in particular invites us to consider the context and the complexities of care and caretaking. And I want to carry those considerations forward into my talk tonight. One last note before I begin is some of you have been hearing me coughing all day, and the unfortunate subtitle of this talk is going to be "There Will Be Coughing." I'm at the end of an infection, and I'm going to cough in that direction if I have to cough. So I'm going to begin. It's 2017, and the world is on fire. 2017 was the worst year on record for forest fires in British Columbia, where I'm from. I remember growing up and hearing the news of summer forest fires in the Okanagan Valley, Salmon Arm, Penticton, other parts of BC that seemed distant to me at the time. Sometimes the news would be about evacuation, families losing their homes. This all felt far away, removed. But in 2017, there was thick smoke in the air from BC forest fires. Smoke covering the sun, smoke stretching down to the lower mainland, the greater Vancouver area, but beyond too, as far as Seattle, Colorado, a thick and looming haze. My parents, who live in Surrey, BC, stayed inside because of respiratory distress. My mom says it felt hard to breathe. My mom and dad staying inside their air-conditioned house at that, is really a minor brunt of creeping climate change. In his book, The Uninhabitable Earth, David Wallace Wells calls out the fallacy of looking at the contemporary rise of natural disasters and thinking, climate change is here. He writes, the devastation we are now seeing all around us, it's a beyond best case scenario for the future of warming and all the climate disasters it will bring. Beyond widespread forest fires in BC and beyond, the contemporary moment has seen record-breaking flooding, drought, and heat waves. I'm mindful of Wallace Wells' reminder that it's the global south that bears and will bear much of the frontline impact of a heating planet and escalating conflict. So why start in 2017? 2017 was the worst year on record for forest fires in British Columbia until 2018. 2018 was the worst year on record for forest fires in BC, and of course, summer 2019 is upon us. I'm starting in 2017 because 2017 was a new phase of my life, a new way of becoming in the world. My daughter, Eleanor, was born on November 1st, 2016. On November 8th, 2016, I took my 8-day-old baby out to a bar because I thought I would be able to tell her she had celebrated the first female U.S. president being elected. We all know that didn't happen, right? Yeah, you got it? Okay. We watched the election results come in while also monitoring the New York Times election prediction results oscillate wildly on our phones. We went home before it had been called, but checked the results when we were up at 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. to feed the baby. This news was dreadful in that it planted dread in me, but this felt somewhat far away, removed. In 2017, I was figuring out what life looked like and meant as a parent, as a mom, learning new grooves, staying closer to home, taking care of a little baby. One way I figured out what life meant was how I figured out a lot of things in my life, or how I have figured out a lot of things in my life, which is through books and through reading. I read to my child, I read, and in some of these books about welcoming a baby, I found a new version of identity for myself I put on uneasily. Mom as a fixed anchoring point, mom as a platform for child to develop a sense of belonging while they go forward in the world. So I don't know how much everyone is up on the Kids Lit theme. That's actually another subtitle of this talk. On the right, there's this classic book, The Runaway Bunny, that you may or may not know, which I really love this book. But in this book, the baby bunny threatens to run away, and the mom bunny keeps shape-shifting to say, wherever you go, I'm going to be there to catch you. So in this particular image, the mama bunny shape-shifts into a tree if the baby bunny is going to fly away. And this other book here I really love. It's really one of my favorite books called You Belong Here. And in this particular passage, it says, no matter what places you travel to, what wonders you choose to see, I will always belong right here with you, and you'll always belong with me, which is beautiful, but also for me was a new way of being, that I would be at home as the anchor, as the mom. In 2017, I was at the Pop Montreal Music Festival, a festival I had attended since 2002, when I moved to Montreal. I lived in Montreal from 2002 until 2015, and that festival had been part of the movement of my life, part of my fall season, roaming around town on my bike, seeing my friends and communities play shows, seeing some unusual and bigger name acts coming into town, participating in and putting on panel discussions for the symposium segment of the festival about the life of the artist, about creative cultures and DIY scenes, about collaboration, all important issues that my research agenda has unfolded around. In September 2017, the Pop Montreal Music Festival looked different for me. I had a 10-month-old baby, and I had less of an appetite and less of a capacity to bop around town between shows. So I went to a few daytime events, visited with my friends and their kids, and I decided on just one show to go to, which was Mount Erie, the stage name of singer-songwriter Phil Elverum, performed at the Ukrainian Federation. Mount Erie had recorded a record about his wife, Geneviève Castré, who had tragically been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer when their baby daughter was 4 months old. Geneviève died when this child was about 1.5 years in 2016. I wasn't a particular fan of Mount Erie's music, but I was of Geneviève's, her capacity to dream magical, beautiful worlds with both her music and her comics. Mount Erie, Phil Elverum, was based in Anacortes, Washington, which is where I grew up camping every summer in coastal Washington state at Deception Pass State Park. Looming forest fires have affected this area, too, and there's been a campfire ban at Deception Pass for many years. Going to this Mount Erie show, I thought it would be sad, but I wasn't prepared for the densely descriptive onslaught of the experience of losing a partner, living through death with a young child, putting together a life in Geneviève's absence. To say that I felt sad can't capture the immensity of loss I felt, the rupture from the known, the way that this loss did not feel far away or removed. The opening of one song in particular landed and stuck. On Crow, Elverum begins by singing, "Sweet kid, what is this world we're giving you, smoldering and fascist with no mother?" I didn't bounce back from this, and this question still resonates with me. What is this world we're giving you? If bouncing is a collision that gains speed and kinetic energy, gains motion, I instead stayed and held in one place, pausing around this driving question of collective urgency. What is this world we're giving you? Instead of bouncing, instead of accelerating and deaccelerating around our contemporary moment of urgency on so many fronts, economic, environmental, political, cultural, social, we might hold and ask what kinds of movement are needed now. The work of holding is a movement of calibration. It's not the movement of roaming around town on my bike, but it's instead the movement of balancing on my bike at a stoplight. It's the micro-adjustments of weight and poise to stay upright. This isn't a movement of anchoring, but it's instead a movement of responsiveness. I hope to parent from this space, to teach from this space, to research and write and speak from this space of ongoing calibration. In my research, I focused a great deal of time listening to and analyzing young people's stories about their journeys into creative industries work. Young people are well aware of the challenges in this sector, but are also seeking to create change. They're creating other possible ways of existing in this environment. Community-oriented work is not a temporary phase in the life course relegated to one's 20s that young people outgrow as they age and need to make a real living. Instead, work today for a growing number of young people might be characterized by an interpenetration of creativity, commerce, and community in light of economic, political, and cultural challenges, not in spite of them. Community-oriented work addresses these challenges instead of being something that these challenges stamp out or preclude from being possible in the long run. Labor conditions in creative fields are bad. As one of my research participants pithily stated, "Shit is hard, yo." I've gathered stories of the young people making a living or trying to make a living in the creative industries, but I've also gathered stories about collective responses, reimagining creative work with a renewed focus on taking care of one another, developing collective strategies to forge new ways of living, working, and being. As another research participant also pithily stated, "We are in this together. Like, shit is fucked. We need to come together." This driving "we" angles towards the heart of neoliberal capitalism against the crisis of capitalism. For Nancy Fraser, this crisis of capitalism is one that divides and pits the work of economic reproduction against the work of social reproduction. While economic reproduction seeks financial gain, social reproduction, as she puts it, is the work of birthing and socializing the young, caring for the old, maintaining households, building communities, and sustaining the shared meanings, effective dispositions, and horizons of value that underpin social cooperation. Without this work, continued economic reproduction is not possible. Fraser defines the historical but changing distinctions between economy and society, between production and reproduction, between work and family as boundary struggles. How we delineate and divide this from that is never complete, and can and does shift. I'm interested in creative industries work as a contemporary site of boundary struggle. How might we recuperate these horizons of value from the exploitation and self-exploitation of passion-led work? Can creative work be mobilized as a site of possible expansion of the known, building the world together through the radical power of imagination, leaving behind individually directed calls to be creative or do what you love? This recuperation means moving beyond a quid pro quo conceptualization of social exchange, centering the work of social reproduction as the work of social transformation. This is a bottom-up revisioning of economic revitalization from a collaborative turn. For Mark Banks, these horizons of value involve a remaking of how we think of economic growth and shifting from a growth model to a prosperity model. Here, the creative industries can have a key role to play. In many global economies, there's been a turn to the creative industries as economic engine and a championing of these forms of industry at the policy level as a means to revitalize declining economies. Mark Banks asserts that the cultural industries are not merely industries, but are forms of social practice that can challenge accepted orthodoxies and provide the conceptual resources for creating images of alternative possible worlds, dream factories in the broadest possible sense. I asked how we might dream this dream together and what building a collaborative dream looks like. The foundation of a collaborative dream must be a foundation of care. In Caring Democracy, Joan Toronto conceptualizes care as the work of democracy, striving for justice, equality, and freedom for all by rethinking responsibility in an expressive, collaborative morality. Toronto and Fisher define care expansively as a species activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. All humans give and receive care. All humans are vulnerable and are in need of others in all phases of their lives. This definition sees care as a social process. First is caring about, paying attention. Next is taking care of, which is responding or taking responsibility. Third is caregiving, which is doing the hands-on work. And last is care receiving, which are the responses of the care receiver to the caring process. Seeing care as this multi-step process is also a useful way to envision social change, away from an all-or-nothing model of complete transformation or continued status quo. Instead, paying attention might be part of the process of transformation. Choosing to respond is also part of the process. Listening to the responses of those whom we are caring for is also the part of this process. When we conceive of care as a multi-step process, we might also imagine that one person does not have to see this whole cycle through. Instead, we might pool our time, material resources, knowledge, and skill. We must also be mindful of the lack of time, material resources, knowledge, and skill that prevent and limit the capacity to care for oneself and others. Caring work has been divided, privatized, and devalued, and as Joan Toronto writes, historically relegated as the concerns of women, working class people, and racial and ethnic minorities. Though this work has been relegated and devalued, this is vital work. We can learn from queer communities, for example, who have mobilized taking care of one another in the absence of social and state provisioning. But what does it mean to collaborate when historic and systemic barriers and biases mean we do not arrive equally equipped to care? For Toronto, the project of democracy is to facilitate the conditions where collective caring is possible. Historically, care has been backgrounded, even if it is a critical part of human life, because economic growth has been so thoroughly foregrounded, as she writes. The goal here is not merely to switch the backgrounding and the foregrounding. Instead, when we envision care as a public good, we can center and value its necessity for our continued survival, economically, socially, culturally, environmentally, and realize the interdependence of these spheres as they rely on care. Moving care to the front is less of a boundary struggle than it is a boundary shift, integrating the social with the economic. Theorizing care requires thinking collectively and relationally. In my research, I suggest that communities of care are a form of collaborative dreaming. Communities of care look outwards, forming loose horizontal networks. We could see the upswing of cooperatives and unionization amongst young people as formalized communities of care. But conceiving of care as a collective process can also provide a framework to take note of smaller actions and in-between moments, support groups, group chats, and also friendship, mutual support, and affirmation. A loose horizontal network brings to mind Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's concept of the rhizome, a continuously growing horizontal underground stem with lateral shoots and haphazard roots. Rhizomes are heterogeneous and make connections to any other thing. Follow the plants, Deleuze and Guattari write. But for Deleuze and Guattari, rats are rhizomes. Tubers and burrows are rhizomes. Horizons of value could be read as rhizomatic. We might also see young people today and their responses to precarity, to interdependent economic, environmental, social, and political problems as rhizomatic. Rhizomatic economic forms might include cooperatives alongside side hustles, alongside skill sharing, alongside choosing not to work or working less, or not only working towards economic gain. But I'm also mindful of the origins of youth cultural studies and the over-determined tone of celebrating youth and resistance. The foundation of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, or the CCCS, the foundation of cultural studies as we know it, was youth studies, and it turned to the emancipatory potential of youth. The 1975 landmark work, Resistance Through Rituals, excitedly chronicled the ways that subculturally involved youth warrened out space. This work mostly landed on young, working-class white men, out in public, taking up space, dressed and acting seemingly outlandishly, but in the CCS analysis, proto-politically, semiotically reading style as necessarily resistant. Aware of these theoretical pitfalls, we might move towards research models that co-create knowledge and research with participants. A collaborative turn in research might mobilize a communities of care framework as methodology that foregrounds cooperation through horizontalization of hierarchies, researching with instead of researching for or researching about. We should be aware of the challenges of this way of working, stepping outside of entrenched patterns of observer and observed, expert and informant. This doesn't transform instantaneously and needs ongoing and self-reflexive work. Thinking of Toronto and Fisher's model of care, we might aspire to research as a way of enacting care, a way of noticing, listening, and acting in the world. We might also consider less spectacular and seemingly more mundane ways of acting and being than what was mapped out in the early CCS course. Deleuze and Guattari cast the rhizomatic as political, but also, importantly, I think, as beautiful and loving. We need to make a space for holding these forms of expression too. Holding a space open for love returns us to the question of where and how to care, and where and how to care in light of looming threats on multiple fronts. Though care might look different in differing contexts, common characteristics of communities of care include empathy, including the need to see and validate the whole person, recognizing the complexity of human life with emotional, physical, intellectual, and spiritual capacities and needs. Equity, including the recognition of historical and continuing inequalities to access and experience along but not limited to race, gender, class, ability, sexuality, and so on, and the need for intentional corrective measures to redress these inequalities. Horizontalization, or the desire to rethink and reconfigure resources and knowledge based in arbitrary forms of power allocation, and instead pool and share resources and knowledge. And collaboration, or the desire to meaningfully work together in group-based settings, across differences, and commit to putting in the hands-on work to realize group efforts. This is difficult and ongoing work. We can't transform the ways we live and work together instantaneously. Still, we want to be aware and be able to notice movement in these directions. I've spent some time recently in the community arts space, documenting these kinds of movement, and researching how these community programs scaffold economic self-advancement for young people. I ended up hearing and seeing how these spaces were not just spaces of economic self-realization. They were also spaces of healing, becoming, exploring, sharing, and holding. In the community arts space, I've seen ongoing work to be vulnerable and to be brave, to commit to the challenges of how to best work together in less hierarchically organized structures. Centering this work first means economic self-realization can become possible. And many of these community arts programs, economic advancement does not just mean building the individual artist's career, but also means community engagement through facilitating arts programs. One research participant states, facilitation is not just about teaching people what you do, but it's also about holding people. Like holding people where they are and having the capacity to understand what their capacities are, emotionally, physically, and then artistically. And having these things expressed to the creative medium that you're facilitating. Communities of care are a way of holding this space for one another to move forward together. At Sketch Working Arts, one of my community arts research partners, one project that does this work is Good Guys, or the Element of He, a group for racialized men to explore and unpack toxic masculinity. When I attended their talk about how to do this work this January, participants discussed how to create a space to explore masculinity by asking questions together and being mindful of how we ask and raise these questions. Even though the language of unpacking can be inaccessible. I was struck by the empathy of the openness and vulnerability of the exploration as each participant took a turn performing, some of them singing a cappella. The Good Guys group has taken to exploring these questions of toxic masculinity through creating together, forming a band that will tour local community programs in May, which they have branded as Racialized Masculinity Month. You have an image here of the band on the left, and I thought in the talk they addressed, which I thought was really interesting, many of the members are musicians or have musical backgrounds, but they made a conscious choice to, in this band, play an instrument that they don't know how to play, to commit to this work of kind of learning and unlearning together, to do something that they don't know how to do and do it together in public. I've seen this work at Rock Camp for Girls, a music education camp for female-identified and gender non-conforming youth. Various chapters of this camp exist around the world, but I co-coordinated the Montreal camp for several years when I lived there. This is a vulnerable and nerve-wracking project, where campers come together to learn an instrument, form a band, write an original song, and perform the song in front of a live audience at a sold-out venue, all in the space of a week. Some of these campers come in on day one without ever having played a musical instrument before. I remember the exuberance of the camp song that we triumphantly sung and screamed together every morning in English and French. Okay, it goes like this. On joue du rock and roll, une semaine pour une chanson, faut que tu fasses attention, on commande votre attention. Made a rock and roll band, wrote a song in 5 days. Now we're on stage, we're gonna rock your faces. Thank you. I thought if I was going to talk about vulnerability in public, I had to actually model it, but I have real barriers about singing, so thank you. For some, holding space is also taking up space, learning to be loud, commanding attention. Like with the good guys, this is the work of equity, creating spaces to work towards redressing inequalities of access and experience. I've seen this work at Whippersnapper, an artist-run center focusing on emerging artists with a particular emphasis on underrepresented communities, where I'm the chair of the board of directors. One of Whippersnapper's most vital projects was the Peers program, led by programming director Jos Vedevielu. Peers was a peer-to-peer mentorship program for emerging artists. Vedevielu's approach to facilitating this program foregrounded a human-centered approach. They prioritized care of people and fostering an intimate space for critical conversations amongst participants, which then enabled further artistic and career development. This movement of horizontalization suggests that when we care about each other first and find ways to talk about our individual and collective struggles, we might move forward next. Currently, Whippersnapper is experimenting with an artist collective incubator model. The Black Artists Union, a collective of 10 Toronto-based emerging Black artists, is programming and curating the gallery shows and other community activations for the year. For some, and for me in this context, and for members of populations that have been historically overrepresented, holding space means giving up space, while continuing to work behind the scenes, if relevant. I've seen this work in Thunder Bay, with the Die Active Art Collective. With its 800 members, Thunder Bay is the home to the largest artist collective in Canada, focusing on emerging artists 14 to 30 years old. In a TED Talk called Breaking the Ties That Bind Us, Diactive founder Laura Northway discusses the work of this collective. The types of projects this collective does are not particularly unique, things like making zines, street art, graffiti walls, youth-led exhibitions, and running workshops. Northway says what is unique about this collective is its structure, which is different from youth arts programs that are for youth but not led by youth. I think this is really key, asking how do we do the work? In Diactive, the members themselves come up with the ideas for the projects, teach each other the skills, and then help each other complete the projects. This is the work of collaboration, figuring out how to do the work together and committing to realizing the work. Continuing to question the space and how it was run also led to Diactive member Lucille Atlukin co-founding an Indigenous-led space for Indigenous youth called Nietzsche Studio. With its 300 Indigenous youth members, Nietzsche runs monthly art workshops with Indigenous youth, sharing traditional and contemporary culturally relevant arts practices. Atlukin says, Nietzsche Studios provides a safe space for members to express themselves without any judgment. Art allows people to communicate in a visual or abstract way. We can see art as a way of holding space, moving past a verbal register for sharing. So where does Canada sit within this work? What opportunities or challenges present themselves here? In 2018, I was presenting some of my research at an international conference, the International Association of Media and Communications Research. I opened my conference paper by surveying some of the well-documented labor statistics about creative industries employment, highlighting that Canada mirrors international trends in these regards. Regarding these trends, I'll simply repeat the quotation from one of my research participants that I started with. Shit is hard. When I got to the question period after the presentation, someone asked me about the Canadian context, saying he was surprised to hear the grim nature of what I had to say about the challenges of making a living as a young artist in Canada. He was surprised because he thought things were better in Canada. I was at the conference to talk about community arts, but I started in that moment talking more broadly about the international image of Canada and sometimes how we still don't recognize and acknowledge Canada's colonial past is genocidal treatment of Indigenous peoples. So I don't think that things are better here on the whole. and we sometimes lack the discourse and engagement with discomfort. I think this work of recognizing the ongoing harm of the colonial past and working collaboratively for collective futures in the project of reconciliation is the most deep and pressing work we have in front of us in Canada today. We need to acknowledge that culture has been an instrument of harm, while envisioning how culture might be a way to stitch community and enact care. Some of this work of reconciliation is the work of listening and learning. I want to share with you some of my listening and learning about truth and reconciliation over the last few years. I want to spend some time sharing with you some of the words from Indigenous leaders and speakers that have landed with me, speaking to the role of youth, community, and caring in moving towards reconciliation. I'm sharing these words with you because I hope they will land and stay with you too. In 2016, the Honourable Murray Sinclair, Canadian Senator and Chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, gave the keynote address at Ryerson's Teaching and Learning Conference. The title of his talk was Canada's Residential Schools, the Story We Must All Know. This history of residential schools is indeed a story we must all know and must keep talking about. This is particularly important in academic and scholastic contexts, and especially important in my home institution, Ryerson, named for Egerton Ryerson, whose belief played a role in the establishment of what became the residential school system. Given the difficulty of this history, I was struck in this talk in the hope that Sinclair placed in youth for reconciliation. He said, "The ones who are going to lead us are the young Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. But keep in mind that for young Indigenous peoples, before we can talk about a mutual relationship, we have to give them an opportunity to develop self-respect first. We need to do what we can to help them to find their self-respect before we can say we have to have mutual respect. Committing to working together means ongoing awareness and reflexivity that the past impacts how we meet each other today." In January, I attended a live taping of a podcast about the future of work produced by the Atkinson Foundation. One of the guests was Max Finday, the Executive Director of Canadian Roots Exchange, a not-for-profit organization that highlights the role of Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth in working towards reconciliation. Asked what gives him hope for the future of work, Finday also talked about the new generation of Indigenous youth coming up, and he said, "I can't stop talking about how proud I am of my nieces and nephews, my cousins, my community, who have come through so much in the last little while and are still reaching out with an open hand to Canada, ready to reconcile. I'm always reminded by the generosity and the love of young people who just want what our ancestors envisioned, and that's peace, prosperity, and mutual respect. If we can build a country, if we can build an economy, if we can build a workforce on those values, then it will be good for everybody." And here I can only say, indeed. In April, I attended the Atkinson Lecture for journalism students at Ryerson by Ryan McMahon, who is an Anishinaabe comedian and host of the Thunder Bay podcast about systemic racism towards Indigenous peoples in that city. But as McMahon says, systemic racism is not just confined to one place in Canada. It's everywhere, and the work of undoing the harm of racism is everyone's work. This spread accountability, but also the collective shouldering of the burden of this work was something that Ryan McMahon discussed in his talk in April. He said, "Colonialism depends on patriarchy. It depends on shit capitalism. It depends on all the things that are hurting us right now. This is what it's been built on, so we've all been touched by it. How do we undo harm in the spaces we live and work? We can. It will take some work. It will take some bravery. It will take community. Not just one of us can do it. We need all hands on deck. Strong hearts to the front. And if you have a strong heart, you come and lead for a little while. And when your strong heart doesn't feel so strong anymore, fall to the back and let someone else take the lead. And if we keep bringing strong hearts to the front with new ideas, new concepts, new ways of doing things, we'll be okay." Truthfully, at that time, that strong hearts to the front part made me a little weepy. Then I had to leave immediately and go teach my class. And I think sometimes we don't have time and space for emotional resonance to resonate. Strong hearts to the front. This is the work of reconciliation, of caring, of holding each other up. I started today talking about reading as a way of learning and as a way of being and becoming, and I want to return there to close. Reading as a movement of holding space for listening and learning, as a way of being and engaging with the world rather than retreating from the world. I see reading as a public act and as a social process. Preparing this talk, I thought about some of the things I wanted to share with you. I thought about reading to my kid and some of the things I hope to teach her. Here, when I thought about this, I also wanted to reflect on that I'm not the only one teaching my kid. It's me, but it's also a constellation of people and public institutions. This is me kind of moving beyond the overly kind of facile saying of it takes a village. I think it takes a constellation of people and public institutions. There's me, my partner, her grandpa. This is us at a community center near where we live, our local library, community center as well, and also her daycare and some of her teachers at her daycare. Because the work of care has been privatized and devalued and relegated as women's work is also grossly underpaid. The teachers at my child's daycare are all women and predominantly women of color. And these are the women raising up my child. And I want to acknowledge that as well. Returning to reading to my child, fortunately for her and fortunately for me, children's publishing, and in particular Indigenous children's publishing, is a vibrant space today. I thought maybe I could read you some of the books I read her. Truthfully, I had planned on reading you a bedtime story. Then I reviewed copyright rules, and recitation rights prevent me from reading a whole work. And that's fine. I'm going to read you a small excerpt of one of my favorite books about reconciliation as the work of holding space. It's called You Hold Me Up by Minnie Grace Smith with illustrations by Danielle. So I'm going to read the last 3 pages of this book, but so much the better that you go purchase it yourselves. If you have a young person in your life, you can buy this book. The illustrator Danielle has another book called Sometimes I Feel Like a Fox, which also is one of my favorites. Minnie Grace Smith has another book called My Heart Fills with Happiness, illustrated by Julie Flett. And Julie Flett is also one of my favorite Indigenous illustrators. And I think this work is important. When we're talking about boundary shift and kind of moving the social in line with the economic, that doesn't necessarily mean that we push the economic aside, especially in the context of reconciliation. Reconciliation also means Indigenous resurgence, including economically, so support Indigenous creators. This book, You Hold Me Up, by Minnie Grace Smith with illustrations by Danielle casts reconciliation in the quieter moments and the quieter movements of kindness, sharing, learning, laughing, and respecting. All of these quieter movements are the work of holding, and the book ends, You hold me up. I hold you up. We hold each other up. I want to hold on the we. Holding is a way of hoping and shaping a collaborative dream. Collectively, we can work to keep this space open. I opened with the horrors of creeping climate change, and I've touched on uncertain futures and colonial pasts, the colonial present. I think many young people feel these threats and these harms acutely and are choosing how they want to respond. The important thing is to continue to try together. Davis Wallace Wells, the author of The Uninhabitable Earth, writes that he's often asked whether it's moral to reproduce in this climate, whether it's responsible to have children, whether it's fair to the planet, fair to the children. We hear about this in the news today, declining birth rates, and millennials even forming support groups to talk through whether or not to have children in light of climate change. Whether or not to have children is, of course, a personal choice, and no one needs to want to have children. But Wallace Wells writes that in the course of writing his book, The Uninhabitable Earth, he did have a child, Roka. I like to think that having children is a hopeful, not a destructive act, committing to dreaming a better future. Wallace Wells writes that the horrors of climate change are not yet fully scripted. We are staging them by inaction, and by action we can stop them, he writes. Here again, I want to echo the driving force of the we, the importance of continuing to care, continuing to seek new horizons of value. In the end, I want to ask, not, what is this world we're giving you, but what is this world we can build together? Thank you.